本番に近いくらいに書いてみないと出てこないアイディアっていうのもあるんですよ。やっぱり絵にしてみたらこれ使えるじゃないかっていうのがこう出てきたり、無意識に書いちゃったものが実はすごく意味があって、じゃあこれは使えるなとか。
Things become confusing when you force something ephemeral to become something more concrete. The monotony of the real world is one that many would refer to as a cage. A safe cage, perhaps, but still a cage, in which its confines are secure, predictable, and most offensive of all, boring. It's why so many of us wish with all our beings that we could often be anywhere else, do anything else, even be anything else. And this fantasy is what often carries us into a lofty sense of whimsical grandeur. This longing for excitement, this expectation that something big, something different, something impossible is just around the corner. Why let yourself drown in the murky waters of the mundane when you could instead fly on the wings of the extraordinary? Why indeed? And I think the answer is a simple one. Because these worlds can't exist without each other. We can dream all we like of a more fantastical tomorrow, but that world is only a brighter reflection of the world around us, which, when you learn to see the forest for the trees, isn't actually as drab as we might first assume. While to us, reality may be less than desirable at times, it's nonetheless important and near pivotal to the prosperity of its counterpart. But the world of dreams and unreality isn't always a bright or happy haven. In the words of Paprika, dreams and the internet aren't that different, and that can be just as worrisome or even dangerous as it can be liberating. I can certainly attest to this as someone who goes so far as to not even show her real face online, instead opting for an adorable green-haired avatar who, before long, took on a personality, backstory, and even a gender all their own. You may see this character and hear my voice being channeled through them and imagine Fionapollo, a light-hearted, open-minded creative who tries to advocate for fellow artists and their endeavours while paving her own way. But what I see is a distorted reflection of my own self staring back at me. Someone who oftentimes feels so lost and disconnected from her chosen pursuits despite encouraging others to take the plunge, even at the risk of repeating those same failures she herself can't seem to bounce back from. Sorry, that's probably a bit too somber of a beginning for a video that's supposed to be focused on celebrating a person's career as a means of spurring other people on who are wanting to follow their own ambitions. But that's almost kind of the point. The duality of ideals versus perceptions, ambition versus duty, fiction versus reality are not always so clear-cut, and many people are going to come away from them forming a near infinite amount of their own thoughts and feelings on the subject. I keep coming back to my own experiences because it's almost a testament to how one person's idea of reality will never be a mirror image of someone else's. Few understood this better than today's person of interest, Satoshi Kon, considered a legend in the animation and manga spheres, and famed for his vision surrounding the oft messy convergence of what is reality and what is fiction. Working with the esteemed mangaka and artists behind such works as Akira and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, before making a name for himself in the world of animated feature films. And I, for one, cannot wait to talk about it with you all. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of my video series Inspiring Animators, where every month I delve into the lives, careers, flagship works, and legacies of various prominent animators in the industry. I chose to do this because, well, commentary makes money, but my god, is covering negative news all the time an energy vampire. So I wanted to work on something that could help balance that out. If you like the sound of that, then please consider liking and subscribing. I post a video every 2 weeks and cover a range of topics pertaining to art, animation, comics, and pop culture. There's bound to be something you like. But enough of all that. With all of the pleasantries and plugs out of the way, why don't we dive right in? Please bear in mind that it's a bit hard to diversify the retelling of someone's biographical life events, even though a decent attempt has been made, and the bulk of this section's research came from several other people's own videos looking into Satoshi Kon's life and works, the largest resource being Steve M's video, The Satoshi Kon Problem. So if it sounds as if any of these passages sound very familiar, it's because they are. There's not really much I can do about that, sadly. Satoshi Kon was born on the 12th of October, 1963 in Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost region where the winters are bitterly cold and snow routinely blankets the island, but the summers are pleasantly cool and are beholden to beautiful wildlife trails and flower fields, offering sublime views and a serene retreat from the hustle and bustle of its larger cities. A duality which may well have been an early contributor to Kon's fascination with the concept. 1963 was an interesting time for Japan in general, far enough away from the horrors of World War II that the wounds were beginning to heal, as the nation busied itself with an almost rigorous self-transformation. This was a world in which the West and East had collided not just in battle, but in stories. particularly in the realm of media and television, which was now just becoming globalized. The domination of American cartoons in particular began to influence the children of Japan in somewhat equal measure to their traditional upbringing. This is something I've actually covered in a previous video that focused on another Japanese anime and manga legend, Osamu Tezuka, who is often credited for spearheading this movement in TV. Satoshi expressed a deep admiration for cartoons and manga, whether it be the homegrown cartoons of Tezuka's Astro Boy or the Fleischer Brothers' portrayals of Popeye the Sailor Man's adventures all the way in the States. When he was still a young boy, his father moved the family due to a job transfer to Sapporo. It was during this time attending Hokkaido Kushiro Koryo High School where Kon became both a classmate and close friend of the mangaka Seiho Takizawa, who later went on to create several manga which primarily focused on pilots and aviation. It was also at this school, and to both Seiho and his other classmates, that Kon first divulged his love of space battleship Yamato, as well as his ambition of becoming an animator, which, kids will be kids, and he did experience some teasing for this. I actually remember experiencing the same thing in my own school. Some things are always the same the world over, I suppose. It's likely due to this that Satoshi spent much of his time with his girl classmates rather than the boys, as he believed they were more complicated and mature, though there is a high chance this was also due to the fact that they probably didn't tease him as much for his interests, and also the fact that he was able to bond with them more readily thanks to his interest in a variety of shoujo manga such as A-Girl. Despite that though, he did join the art and manga club at his school, where his senior classmen also opened him up to properties like Gundam. During the late 1970s and early 80s, this was also built upon thanks to the emergence of the New Wave comics movement, which prioritized the creation and focus of more mature, intricate stories intended for older readers. Thanks to this, there was a rise in general intrigue towards working as mangaka in Japan, and even though Satoshi didn't necessarily want to become one himself, he still had an innate love of drawing, and decided to apply to the 10th Tetsuya Chiba Awards in 1984, winning a very respectable second place. This of course then led him to considering the profession more seriously, and proceeded to begin working for Young Magazine, which at the time was publishing one such story that went on to become an enduring classic, known as Akira, created by Katsushiro Otomo. Kon also took heavy inspiration for his own early manga stories and imagery during the time that he was helping out on Akira, the evidence of which is very unsubtle, to say the least. Sometime later, however, Kon finally had the opportunity to commercially work on and publish his own comic for Young Magazine. This manga was called Tropic of the Sea, which is a magical realism story revolving around the moralistic duties of tradition. It follows a rural fishing village in which the protagonist's family is entrusted with a mermaid egg. Returning it to the sea once it matures will result in a prosperous fishing season for the village. The working conditions of the manga, however, were nothing short of brutal. Kon and his team were given 3 months to create 200 pages. This, combined with the fact that Kon decidedly worked on a big chunk of the manga all on his own, led to him becoming what was essentially an involuntary recluse, unable to leave his apartment for extended periods. It's no small secret that mangaka are extortionately overworked and underpaid for the amount of quality they are expected to produce, and it is an insidious, enduring issue that has plagued the print media industry for decades, with no sign of improvement even today. Many amazing and ambitious artists became victims of their own works, some even losing their lives due to the stress, and they are reduced by the industry as nothing more than a cautionary tale without any kind of acknowledgement that maybe something should change to avoid further tragedies. Satoshi describes that he had 2 days to finish the storyboard, 3 days for the rough sketching, and 2 days to ink the pages, all for the purpose of reaching the weekly deadline set by Young Magazine. Kon during this time took to drinking as a form of self-soothing, allowing himself a nightcap before bed to sleep only a few meager hours before his schedule forced him to wake early and continue the grueling cycle. And even though he was still young at the time, the lasting impact this wreaked upon his health is a testament to the awful conditions he worked in. Kon ended up succumbing to intense fatigue and a 104-degree fever for half a month, and then was later hospitalized for another month from hepatitis A, a condition caused by the infection of the liver due to contamination of water or food with the HIV virus, the effects of which include extreme fatigue, nausea, and most concerningly, jaundice. It's worth noting that Tropic of the Sea was completed despite this, and Kon even went back some years later to clean up and correct things to republish the manga in paperback form. But this really speaks to the harshness of completely dedicating yourself to a particular creative endeavour, as well as the dangers of being young and falling victim to the predatory demands of a larger entity that assumes any degree of control over your creative pursuits. We've seen this in so many creative industries, the most strikingly similar to this being the working conditions endured by many webtoon original artists in recent years. Your creative passions are not worth your life. Please remember that. Following that though, it is hard to keep creative down, and after he recovered from his stint in the hospital, both Satoshi Kon and Katsushiro Otomo got together, indulged in an intensive drinking session, and brainstormed for their next creative project. Otomo's Akira series had by this point in the early 90s become a major bestseller, which allowed him to make the transition to filmmaking as well, and the two proceeded to work on World Apartment Horror together, Otomo's first foray into live action aided by both Kon and screenwriter Keiko Nobumoto. The results were... well, the story definitely had a lot of thematic markers found throughout Otomo's existing works at the time, as well as in Kon's future ones, but it didn't particularly feel like it was best executed in live action. There were a lot of budgetary and production limitations which impeded its ability to be as imaginative as what the duo likely intended, and it seems that Kon agreed as he proceeded to adapt the story in manga form himself. But thanks to this first step and Otomo's help, Kon was finally able to make that transition into the anime industry that he promised himself, managing to work as a storyboarder and assistant director on the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure OVA from 1993. During this time, Kon was still working on his own manga stories, and in 1995 began to serialize his story Opus in the Comic Guys magazine from 1995 to 1996, before the magazine ceased production. The story follows a mangaka who is pulled into the world of manga he had created, and is forced to confront his characters and the story's ending in order to escape. Opus is heavily credited as being a pivotal piece of Kon's career and the solidification of his affinity for the blurring of reality and fiction, which would later become a defining characteristic of his work. And this only continued on into his progression into the world of the moving image. In fairness, almost every one of Kon's works has garnered critical acclaim and widespread recognition in some form, but in the interest of not letting this section become too bloated, I've narrowed this down to 3 particular films that I believe exemplify Kon's career, as well as the general public perception of him as a filmmaker. And also because they were the ones I could find in my local HMV. Before we dive into those though, let's give a bit more background on what led up to it. So Kon began working in the anime industry around 1992 as a scriptwriter, layout artist, and background designer for Magnetic Rose, which was one of 3 short films in Otomo's omnibus Memories that released in 1995. This was the first time that he adopted the fusion of fantasy and reality as the theme of his work, and what also pushed a lot of the inspiration behind his manga Opus that we discussed earlier. With Otomo as the executive producer and Kon as the writer, Magnetic Rose's reception far outspent the other 2 stories that were part of its collective anthology. The story is often attributed as a blueprint of the popular sci-fi trope of what is affectionately referred to as ghost ships in space, where explorers come across a distress signal only to become victims of whatever lurks on the dilapidated ship or station they happen upon. Following this, Kon also worked as a storyboarder and assistant director on the OVA for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure between 1993 and 94, a role which garnered significant praise for his work, and which also got him noticed by one Masao Maruyama, who then proceeded to invite him to work with Madhouse Studios as a director for one of their projects. Due to this, in 1997, Kon began work on his directional debut film, which was an anime adaptation of Yoshikazu Takeuchi's novel Perfect Blue. The original novel centered on a young Japanese idol who wanted to pursue acting, and thus became the target of a malicious stalker who couldn't handle her change in career and image. When the idea was first presented to Kon by Maruyama, it was for an OVA project after Yoshikazu Takeuchi, acting as the original director, was unable to secure funding for a live-action adaptation, which resulted in it being downsized to a direct-to-video animation. Shortly before Kon completed the project, however, it was then decided to extend the production to a full-length animated film. Ironically, Kon didn't seem to enjoy working on the film as much as its others, since he isn't actually a fan of horror and had little knowledge or even interest in the idol industry, but with how effective the film actually is, you wouldn't guess that, would you? I guess that seems to be par the course or something. A fun fact, but I recall ages ago seeing, I think it was Rody Montillo, I hope I said that right, one of the creators of Happy Tree Friends, a notoriously gory satirization of the friendly woodland creature archetype rampant in Western cartoons, state in a TikTok that he doesn't actually like blood.
Yeah, no, I don't really do mud.
But you're a garden fairy!
Ironic, isn't it?
Whether he was telling the truth or not remains to be seen, but I just thought that was a funny little thing to mention. Every so often, the people who create the most groundbreaking or genre-defining pieces of media are the ones who are somewhat emotionally removed from it. and I just find that really fascinating. But coming back to the film's production, Kon was notably unsatisfied with the original script, and proceeded to ask Takeuchi if he could make some of his own changes. He was granted this permission so long as 3 main aspects remained: idol, fan, and horror. Interestingly, the pivotal core of the film, the protagonist Mima's descent into madness as her personal life and her acting role in the TV drama she's working on begin to overlap, was almost entirely of Kon's own invention. Thanks to his previous works that dealt with the blending of reality and dreams, this provided the perfect psychodrama backdrop to the events of the original novel and added a whole other layer of suspense to the narrative. The end result was a masterclass in sequential storytelling that pulled the viewers this way and that as far as their expectations and perceptions of what was actually happening and where the film was headed was concerned. And that remained for a time the film's hugest strength, until of course, the age of the internet celebrity and influencer arrived, and all of a sudden the film took on a whole new layer of relevance as the average person now became so much closer to experiencing the same terrifying scenarios as Mima did. Stalkers, albeit having always been a legitimate issue, have become a much more common and visible threat to the average person, as parasociality has exploded thanks to online exposure. The crisis of identity that can be ravaged by something as small as a change to social media algorithms can cause an individual who built up their careers in one specific area to succumb to a downward mental spiral, and the ever-present looming of your past always being one step behind you, waiting to undo any and all attempts to move any further away from it as people weaponize past mistakes and missteps when you dare to put even a single toe out of line. The emergence of such a precarious digital landscape reinvigorated many people's interest in this film, and solidified Perfect Blue's legacy in pop culture even after almost 30 years. The film was likened to Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho, thanks to the similarities of a misdirected stalker and the building suspense of things not being as they should be, and this proved to be a very potent method of storytelling. And just as Kon was questioned as to whether he took inspiration from other directors supposedly took inspiration from his vision as well. The most notable examples being the bathtub scene in Requiem for a Dream, released in 2000, being a shot-to-shot mirror image of the one shown in Perfect Blue, and Black Swan, a film released in 2010 that chronicled the mental descent of a ballerina who is chosen for the leading role in the ballet Swan Lake. While Black Swan's director Darren Aronofsky rebuffs insinuations from critics that he took any inspiration from Perfect Blue, Kon did note on his personal blog that he and Aronofsky had met up in 2001, which did cast some doubt over Aronofsky's claims. That said, it isn't uncommon for directors to acknowledge similarities between their own films and the works of others without having actually seen them firsthand. A similar thing also happened with Ari Aster, director of Midsommar in 2019, which had multiple similarities to the 1973 horror film The Wicker Man, despite Aster's claims that he deliberately chose not to watch The Wicker Man simply because of how similar both films were in terms of premise, in order to avoid any further subconscious comparisons. We'll never know whether Aronofsky was being truthful, but as the saying goes, imitation is the highest form of flattery. Moving swiftly on, Kon's intended next film after Perfect Blue was actually going to be Paprika, but unfortunately plans were stalled due to the distribution company going bankrupt. So instead, Paprika was shelved while he worked on Millennium Actress, which released in 2002. I would give a bit more of a detailed explanation on Millennium Actress, the same as the other films we discuss here, but unfortunately it didn't appear to reach the same level of notoriety as those other films, which of course meant that I couldn't find a DVD copy of it in stores in the UK in order to actually watch it. The film chronicles the life of a retired actress told by interweaving her real life with the plots and events of many of her films, causing the lines between the two to become almost indistinguishable. I'm going to assume the reason this film isn't as talked about as the others in Kon's repertoire is likely because it was the film that came directly after Perfect Blue and had a bit too similar of a theme and premise, both films focusing on actresses and the lines between their professional and personal lives becoming entangled. That's not a dig at Millennium Actress, by the way. It's a gorgeous film, it's a very good film, and there is a lot of praise. It's just very, very similar to Perfect Blue. I'm assuming this probably caused many people to kind of see it as the lesser of two sister films before he went on to make something different. And that something different ended up being Tokyo Godfathers in 2003. While Tokyo Godfathers is a much more grounded film than, say, Perfect Blue, it is still referred by Kon himself as being a sort of twisted, sentimental story, as it follows a sort of absurdist quest of three homeless people in Tokyo as they try to find the identity of an abandoned baby's birth parents during Christmas time. A large bulk of this is down to its inspiration, an old American Western from 1948 called Three Godfathers, the plot of which revolves around three rough-tumble men on a roundabout quest to honour the wish of a dying mother who dies in childbirth, and dubs them as the baby's godfathers to keep the infant safe. Although The Three Godfathers is a decidedly much more morose film, with multiple of the core cast passing away, it's very clear where the concept for Kon's rendition originated. Tokyo Godfathers dealt very heavily in miracles and coincidences to propel the story, but despite that, it is not only the most grounded, but in my opinion the most humorous and also heartwarming of the three, as it is an extremely poignant look into the world of many demographics that you don't typically see in anime. Homeless people, broken families, immigrants, queer people, many groups that make up the underrepresented percentages of the Japanese population who are often disenfranchised and forgotten about, but they are spotlighted in this film front and centre, and to top it all off, it is done so in a way that emphasises the importance of kindness and understanding towards your fellow man, and the unspoken duty to love and inspire the best in those around you. It's a wonderful film that places humanity at the forefront, and I would recommend absolutely everyone to watch it at least once if possible. The animation was intended to spotlight Tokyo as a much more prominent backdrop than it had been in previous projects, and this also meant that the characters had to be as richly animated as possible to hold up against the scenery. One method undertaken for that was that Kon wanted the movements to be exaggerated but realistic. In fact, in the bonus features of the DVD, we actually get to see Kon, his wife Kyoko, and the producer, Satoshi Toyoda, all dressed as Hana, Miyuki, and Jin respectively, doing various walking shots to use as references for the animators. The heart of this film very much lies squarely with the relationship between the three protagonists. Jin, a middle-aged man who struggles with addiction to the point where he abandoned his family to live on the streets out of embarrassment. Hana, a transgender woman who worked in a queer bar and felt she couldn't return after retaliating against a customer. And Miyuki, a young girl who stabbed her dad after suspecting that he got rid of her pet cat and became too terrified to return home. All three of them, despite being down on their luck, chose to look out for and care for one another. And also just a note on Hana and the portrayal of her queerness from the perspective of my partner who helped me on the script, who also happens to be trans. It's important to note that Hana is representative of being an okama, a slang umbrella term for effeminate men, drag queens, and trans women. And while she does embody some stereotypical behaviours of that group, I can't help but feel nothing but warm affection towards her portrayal. While the film employs a cartoonish, dramatic, and almost rubbery sense of movement for the character animations, the fact that this was never at odds with the female character's relationship with womanhood and never being forced to compromise on this, it was just really refreshing to see. It's also very rare to see characters like this be so unambiguously good and heroic. So many times in media, especially in Japanese animation, this stereotype is used to often creep out the traditional heroes or to serve as a warning or comic relief, but Hana thankfully didn't fall prey to that, and this is something we see with a number of characters in Kon's films. He's never really shied away from depicting all sorts of different kinds of people, and I think this definitely plays into the popularity of his work. It's also quite interesting to note that all three of these characters are framed in the story as having chosen to become homeless rather than it being a situation that is thrust upon them. I'm not really 100% sure on how to interpret that as far as Kon's own perspectives on the homeless, but considering the story is quite outlandish and despite its humble premise, it is also built upon the choice made by these characters to help a child in need. So I suppose it does fit with the thematic significance of action and consequences being present throughout the film, since all three of the characters are in a kind of cyclical situation of running away and becoming homeless due to their own choices. But nevertheless, Tokyo Godfathers is a film about finding hope within the most unexpected of places, and about being the ones to step up and do the right thing even amid a whole breadth of insane circumstances. I would certainly rank this as one of Kon's most heartfelt works. As noted by Kon himself, when looking back at Perfect Blue and Millennium Actress, the film he truly felt he was attempting to make was Paprika. Adapted from the 1993 novel of the same name by Yasutaka Tsutsui, and after having been planned out for several years but not quite managing to come to fruition, Paprika was finally released in 2006. The story revolves around the theft of a device created as an emerging form of psychotherapy, which allows people to enter dreams. This causes masses of people to enter a waking psychosis where they are unable to tell dream from reality as their dreams begin to converge into one, and it becomes the job of a prominent psychiatrist who goes by the pseudonym of Paprika to put things right. Paprika is an experience. It's definitely not the easiest film to understand upon first viewing, but at the same time, it feels as if that's kind of the point. The world of the subconscious doesn't really make sense when lined up against the rigidness of the waking world. So why would a film so intently focused on the expression of dreams be any different? It's only after watching the film, struggling with its message a bit, and then going back to comb through reviews, analyses, and think pieces, as well as Kon's own comments, do I feel a bit more confident in the message I personally took away from it. And what I finally ended up taking away from it is that this is a film all about connection separation between who you are and who you want to be. There are several instances of this happening with many of the characters, most prominently with the protagonist, Dr. Atsuko Chiba, who feels that she struggles to truly connect on a deeper level, not only with her patients, but in her interpersonal relationships, and thus finds this much more achievable through her dream persona Paprika. We also see it in Dr. Kosaku Tokita, a brilliant scientist and inventor who views his invention through the lens of an idealist, without much regard for how others may choose to use it maliciously. Due to this, many other characters also kind of view him as an immature child in an adult's body. Tokita is an interesting ploy of this world, as he exemplifies a more neutral or even positive view of the otaku as opposed to previous depictions within Kon's works. A naive individual who sees the world in somewhat of an evergreen lens, who rejects the idea of change and as a result struggles to find common ground with or consider the feelings of those around him. But eventually he does come around, the same as Chiba. This sense of connection is also visible in Detective Toshimi Konakawa, one of Paprika's current clients, as it becomes clear further on in the film that he harbours a love of movies and once upon a time wished to be a filmmaker, but stopped due to a lack of confidence in his abilities and instead became a policeman. I don't know if you can hear all the meowing, but someone is throwing a tantrum! Finally, the theme shows itself once more in Dr. Seijiro Inui, the paraplegic chairman of the Institute of Psychiatric Research at which Paprika and Tokita are employed. Initially shown as being concerned for the dangers of the technology that Tokita is developing, instead he's revealed to be the antagonist who wishes to remake the dream world in his own image and brand himself as a king. It's also worth noting that the original novel happens to be the influence behind Kon's fascination with dreams fusing into reality within his films, which makes sense when looking at the timeline. Paprika was published at the same time as when Kon was working on Perfect Blue. He even likened the opportunity to work on such a film as destiny, and this enthusiasm appears to be reciprocated as Tsutsui granted Kon full creative control to interpret the story and conduct the project as he so pleased. And to that effect, he did so with fervour. And my goodness, did that work out, because this happens to be one of the best looking out of all of Kon's films in my opinion. Even right from the beginning with the police officer's dream. Everything from the fluidity of the character movements, the lighting and saturation change between dreams and the real world, the intricacies of the converging dream, and all the moving parts harmonizing together. It's a veritable feast for the eyes. It all comes together so strikingly that it's hard not to prioritize the visual delights over an admittedly confusing premise that requires specific concentration and multiple rewatches. And not only that, the soundtrack wins out as well, having this crazy mix of Vocaloid voice synths, electronic backings, and some orchestral elements thrown in to bring it all together, and this was all thanks to the legendary Japanese composer Susumu Hirasawa. Paprika at its release was given no small amount of praise from everything from the production quality to the many different Hollywood motifs and references, with one critic even stating that it was the most mesmerizing animation long player since Miyazaki's Spirited Away 5 years ago. And after having finally released the film, Kon himself regales that after finally making the source of his inspiration into its own film, he's almost gotten a sense of closure to his career and instead wanted to look at creating animation for children. So there we have it. It certainly is quite the feat to have attained such a monumentally successful career with only a handful of films, but that just goes to show what a strong vision and inspiration can do for you. I wish I could go into some of his other projects in more detail, such as Millennium Actress and even Paranoia Agent, but the aim of this video is to gain an understanding of a filmmaker's most notorious projects and how precisely all these aspects manage to fall within their favour. And as usual, a very similar handful of themes pop up. Nearly every animator I have covered so far has had a fascination with comics and drawing in general before progressing to the animation industry, with comics in particular giving people that confidence in both art and storytelling to be able to transfer those skills later on. Being connected to the people around you was another thing. Even in high school, Kon knew of and was friends with fellow mangaka even before joining Young Magazine and developing a close partnership with the likes of Akira's Otomo. And even when conversing with people who were helping develop his films, he was always described as a kind person who took others out to lunch or chatted with them at their desks whenever he could. And this really reinforces to me that it's the people who make the industry, not just the product. Otherwise, no one would really be all that bothered about the person behind these films. That sense of connection is a clear insignia of Kon's working philosophy. Reality, dreams, duality, and connection. Speaking of which, now that we've covered the main flagship works that exemplify Kon's career, why don't we take a bit more of a closer look at some of the artistry involved? So for this style analysis section, I decided to use various storyboards to use as a reference, since Kon was often the primary storyboard artist for nearly all of his projects. So they are probably the most reliable source aside from his manga. This was arguably the easiest of these that I've done so far because A, I'm very familiar and comfortable with anime art style since I've done them since I was about 11, and B, I'm also familiar with storyboards because I've been doing them for over 10 years at this point. I'm not as good at them as what Kon has shown to be, but at the same time, he was an industry professional with several professionally published manga and films, so there's that. So the first thing that caught my eye was just how clean and locked down a lot of these storyboards are. So typically with storyboards, and especially animatics, they tend to not be the most detailed thing in the world, since all of the detail is going to be added in at various stages up to the final render. You also have to do them quite fast depending on what your deadline might be, so the job of refining initial storyboards is usually left to the storyboard revisionist. But sometimes you will get artists who are very particular about a direction or a feel of a shot and will choose to include as much initial detail as possible. This tends to be much more common in film since it's a standalone product rather than a whole collection of episodes, and so the workload doesn't tend to be as rushed due to shorter deadlines. Another thing that I also do love about Kon's works, which I kind of wish I'd also taken a try at drawing, except I couldn't really find many readily available storyboards to derive from, is how realistically he draws many of his characters. And I don't just mean that as in like, you know, they look as close to realism as possible. There's a common stereotype in anime, we all know it, and it was especially pretty bad in the 2010s where every single character was paper white, almost like the saturation got turned up to the max, and there is almost no body diversity. Creating worlds that you like the idea of is fine, and having very specific body types or very specific types of characters in there is fine too. But it's also not the end-all be-all of film or anime for that matter, and people are allowed to comment on that. Kon wasn't afraid of depicting people with very prominent and specific features who were not only interesting to look at, but who actively drove the plot forward. Two standout characters being Hana from Tokyo Godfathers and Tokita from Paprika. Kon is also generally fond of depicting women, which is pretty obvious both from his films and the fact that he actively enjoyed shoujo manga as a young boy. I also especially like that he knew how to depict women in a way that, even during dark moments, it was never framed as gratuitous. It was always shown as how the characters themselves would envision it, rather than through the more voyeuristic third-party viewing of the audience or imaginary camera. This willingness to depict women with varying features and body types also extended to cis women as well, particularly with the likes of Rumi from Perfect Blue, or even Miyuki and the Hitman's Wife from Tokyo Godfathers. So what I tried to do here basically is copy what I saw and then try to learn Kon's style through muscle memory and repetition before trying to impose that style on my own character. And I'd say it worked pretty well. Probably helps that my style is already quite similar, so it wasn't too difficult. One of the most notable aspects to how Kon draws characters aside from body type is also in how he goes about drawing hair. This tends to be something you see in a lot of anime from like the 90s, 2000s, I'd say, and I think one reason for that may be Kon himself, but he tends to take hairstyles as more of a suggestion than anything, choosing to keep them as a kind of block shape without actually adding in much definition, and the result is actually quite nice. It's likely this was also done because it was a massive time saver considering how detailed this style is for something like manga and film, which are both pretty labor intensive. I also really enjoy the rubbery facial expressions of Tokyo Godfathers in particular, so I tried to take a little bit of inspo from that as well in one of the sketches. The term rubbery also does a surprising job of reminding me that Kon was just as inspired by Western works as well. Considering he grew up watching the Fleischer Brothers, this isn't much of a surprise, but it's definitely something that I think lent to the more globalized appeal of many of his works, since Westerners could likely relate to this more exaggerated style of visuals within animation. All that aside though, I quite like these a lot. It helps that this is the exact kind of anime that I enjoy, so it wasn't exactly difficult for me to reference and incorporate into my own style for these sketches. This realistic form of drawing though, again, really plays into Kon's themes of duality, I think. Having realistically proportional characters being immersed in settings that are steeped in a sort of elevated logic, not often possible in the real world they're usually accustomed to, is another pretty on-the-nose nod to his hallmarks as a filmmaker. With that then, we do have a few more things to cover, but I am really sad to say that this video has a bit of a bittersweet ending. No one likes to ruminate on what it means to be given a time limit on this earth. We are all painfully aware that our time is limited, which is why so many of us seek out a means of leaving an impression or making sure we enjoy the ride as much as possible before the clock strikes 12. None of us really know for sure when our time is over, but being made aware of it drawing near can certainly be a world-shattering revelation. In 2010, during his work on his next film, Dreaming Machine, Kon was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer, during which he was given only half a year to live. He and his wife took to researching various methods of prolonging it and received support from various friends, but ultimately he chose not to use any anti-cancer medication, opting instead to spend the remainder of his time on Earth at home and took to making preparations for when he finally left for good. A few friends helped him set up a company so as to protect his copyright material, and he also wrote a will that ensured his wife would receive any modest assets. But for the most part, it seems that he quietly withdrew from the dizzying bustle of a fast-paced media industry and focused on spending what time he had left being as comfortable as possible at home with Kyoko. During this time, he also experienced a bout of pneumonia that very nearly cut his already short time left even smaller, but thankfully he was able to recover, and the conclusion that he would only live for 1 to 2 days with the condition allowed Kon and his family to advocate for taking him home, as opposed to the doctor's original plan of keeping him in a stuffy, drab hospital room. After being brought back home following pneumonia, he managed to make a surprise recovery, after which he then wished to talk to several family members, friends, and colleagues as a matter of urgency. These included Mariama and, of course, his parents. His mother, upon seeing her son, uttered the words, "I'm sorry for not bringing you into this world with a stronger body." Kon sadly succumbed to his illness on August 24th, 2010, at just 46 years old. Shortly before his death, Kon composed a final message which he requested that his family upload to his blog upon his death, which details some of what I just mentioned. I'm not going to read it out to you all, as I don't think I physically can. My own relationship with death is complicated, but I will provide a link, and I can also tell you that Stephen, whose video I used for much of my own research, took the liberty of doing so himself. When this news came to light, it caused shockwaves through not only his fan community, but the wider anime and manga industry, as the cancer's advancement had been so rapid that he seemed in relatively good health the last time anyone had seen him publicly. Maruyama resolved that he would do his best to finish Kon's final unfinished film, Dreaming Machine, but found that after 5 years of trying to do so, he couldn't quite find anyone up to the task, and also conceded that he feels it couldn't be referred to as Kon's film anymore if it did get complete. He noted that a documentary may instead be a more honourable homage to such a great filmmaker, and this documentary was brought into the world in 2021, titled Satoshi Kon, The Illusionist. The documentary features interviews with animators, voice actors, producers, directors, and writers who all worked alongside Kon during his career, and it chronicles his life in a similar, if more in-depth fashion than I have here, and I would urge you all to give it at least a cursory glance. The loss of such a wonderful artist is a difficult reality to grapple with, but even despite that, we still have the remnants of his memory, his ambition, and his dreams. And he managed to do something amazing that only great artists can do. He turned his dreams into a reality that people can enjoy and come back to again and again, and be grateful that he cared enough to share them with us. Satoshi Kon will never be forgotten, so long as we all dare to dream. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this installment of the series. It's a bittersweet one compared to the others, but regardless, I'm glad I could finally talk about Satoshi Kon and his wonderful works. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider liking and subscribing. What do you think about Satoshi Kon? Which of his projects would you say is your favourite? And which inspiring animator do you think we should discuss next? Please let me know. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters. Thank you to my tip jar supporter, Pedantic Cat. Thank you to my YouTube peeps, Manuel Exom Gonzalez, Mystic Mind, Lauren R, Ash Valentine, Lonim the Hare, Craig, Edboy, Stefka's Doodles, and Why Not Warrior. And an extra special thank you to my indie production supporters, Morgan LaFader Thin, Matty A, Kiyoshi, Roundcat, and Arsonist. If you're interested in becoming a patron yourself, a link to my page can be found in the video description. Stay safe, everyone, and I will speak to you all very soon. Bye!